I was 28 years old when my parents threw my life onto the front lawn like it was trash they no longer wanted to claim, and the sound of my suitcase hitting the concrete is something I still hear clearly because it landed hard enough to split the zipper and scatter my clothes across the grass in front of our house. My house, I thought while my father, Robert Young, stood on the porch with his arms crossed and his jaw set in that familiar way that always meant he had already decided I was wrong before I spoke, and my mother, Linda Young, hovered just behind him pretending to look calm, while her fingers trembled against the doorframe. Not from fear, but from the kind of excitement she always got when control shifted back into her hands, and I remember noticing the sky that afternoon was painfully blue, the kind of clear suburban afternoon that makes everything feel exposed, because within seconds, Mrs. Parker from across the street stepped onto her driveway with her phone raised, and then Mr. Collins next door leaned against his mailbox pretending to check the mail while recording, and it became obvious very quickly that this was not a private family disagreement, but a public removal. A performance meant to teach me a lesson. And when my father lifted my second bag and threw it down the steps with less care than he would have given a broken chair, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that came from years of learning when to stay quiet to avoid escalation, because Robert Young was not a man who yelled to be heard. He yelled to intimidate, and he did it best when he knew other people were watching. And even though no one laid a hand on me that afternoon, the threat was always there in his voice when he said loudly enough for the street to hear that I was ungrateful, disrespectful, and no longer welcome under his roof. And I stood there in the driveway holding my keys, which suddenly no longer worked because he had changed the locks while I was at work earlier that day. A fact he announced proudly as if it were a legal victory rather than what it actually was. An act of control meant to remind me that everything in my life had always depended on his permission. And the worst part was not the humiliation or the cameras or the way my neighbors avoided my eyes. It was the way my mother nodded along beside him, her lips pressed into a thin line, as if she were agreeing with a reasonable decision rather than standing by while her daughter was being discarded. And she told me calmly that this was for the good of the family, that my younger brother Ethan needed stability, that I was old enough to figure things out on my own. And her words hit harder than the suitcase because I had heard versions of them my entire life whenever something was taken from me and handed to him instead. And when I bent down to gather my clothes from the grass, my father snapped at me to hurry up and get off his property, his voice sharp enough that I froze for a moment instinctively, the way I always had when his temper rose, and the memory of broken plates and slammed doors and nights spent locked in my childhood bedroom with music playing loudly to drown out his anger flashed through my mind, and I realized with a strange sense of clarity that this was exactly what they wanted for me to cry, or beg, or shout back so they could justify what they were doing. But I did none of those things. I simply picked up my phone, ignored the murmurs spreading through the street, and scrolled to a contact I had saved months earlier under a name that meant nothing to anyone else. And when I pressed call, my hand shook just slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing that once this started, there would be no going back. And when the voice on the other end answered, I said only my name and my address, and then I listened as he told me he would be there shortly, and I hung up without explaining anything to my parents, because explaining had never protected me before. And I sat down on the edge of my open suitcase right there on the driveway, while my father scoffed and asked who I thought I was calling as if the answer could possibly matter. And I remember thinking how strange it was that after years of being told I owed them everything, they never once asked why I was so calm, because if they had, they might have realized that this moment had not caught me unprepared. It had simply arrived exactly when it needed to. And as the sun beat down and the cameras kept recording and my parents retreated back inside, believing the door they had locked was the end of this story, I waited, breathing slowly, surrounded by the evidence of my own removal, knowing that the next person to step onto that driveway would change everything they thought they controlled. The minutes stretched after the door closed behind my parents, and with it came a different kind of pressure, not from shouting or threats, but from the weight of being watched, because the street did not return to normal the way it usually did after an argument. Instead, it settled into a quiet semicircle of attention where people pretended to mind their own business while keeping me perfectly centered in their frames, and I could feel it in the way Mrs. Parker shifted her stance to keep the sun behind her phone camera, and the way Mr. Collins stopped pretending to sort his mail altogether, leaning openly now with his elbows on the box, as if he had paid admission, and somewhere farther down the block a garage door lifted slowly and then stopped halfway when its owner realized something more interesting was happening outside, and I became acutely aware of how small my driveway felt when it turned into a stage. How exposed I was sitting there with my clothes half folded, half scattered, my life reduced to items people could identify and judge. A work blazer, a pair of running shoes, a folder of documents I had grabbed instinctively when I first saw the locks had been changed, and I did not rush to gather anything because moving too fast had always been interpreted as guilt in that house. So I sat still and let the moment stretch, and the longer it did, the more confident my parents must have felt inside, because from behind the closed door, I could hear the faint click of another lock being turned, and my father speaking in the low, satisfied tone he used when he believed he had won. And that sound carried through the quiet street like punctuation final and deliberate. And a few neighbors nodded to one another as if to say they understood family matters unfortunate but necessary. And I wondered how many of them had ever heard him shouting late at night through those same walls, or seen the way my mother would close her eyes and smile tightly afterward as if nothing had happened, and the thought made my stomach tighten. Not with anger, but with the old familiar awareness that appearances had always mattered more to them than impact, and that this public removal was not a loss of control, but a demonstration of it, because humiliation works best when witnesses are present, and I could feel it pressing in on me now from all sides, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. What did she do? Why would parents do this? Is she safe? And no one asked any of them aloud, because that would have required choosing a side, and choosing a side in a small neighborhood is something people avoid unless forced, and I realized with a strange detachment that my parents had counted on, silence and assumptions doing the work for them. And for a brief moment the urge to explain rose in my chest, to tell someone that I had not stolen or lied or failed, that I had simply stopped agreeing to be controlled. But I swallowed it because explanations invite debate, and debate was not something I needed right now. And when Mrs. Parker finally cleared her throat and asked if I was all right in the careful tone people use when they want to appear kind without getting involved, I nodded once and thanked her and said I was fine, and that single word seemed to disappoint her, more than tears would have, because calm offers no drama to record, and she lowered her phone slightly as if unsure what to do next. And the afternoon heat pressed down, making the air shimmer above the asphalt, and my skin prickled not from the sun, but from the awareness that every second I remained there unbroken complicated the narrative my parents were trying to sell, and I saw it register on a few faces as the minutes passed, and I did not leave or call for help or collapse, because people expect shame to move quickly to drive someone away, and when it does not, they start to wonder what they are missing. And the murmurs began, then low and indistinct, but present whispers drifting from driveway to driveway, and I heard my name once carried on the breeze, and my mother must have heard it too, because the curtain in the front window shifted slightly before snapping back into place. And I knew she was watching from inside, measuring the damage, calculating whether this scene was unfolding the way she had planned, and the knowledge steadied me further, because this was not just my humiliation, it was her test of social control. And as the sun crept lower and the neighborhood lingered instead of dispersing, I understood that the longer I stayed seated there breathing evenly, not arguing or apologizing, the more that control began to erode. Because silence has a way of changing the shape of a crowd, and as I waited, I could feel something subtle turning not in my favor yet, but away from theirs. And that was when I checked my phone again. Not to make another call, but to confirm the time, and I allowed myself a small internal acknowledgement that whatever came next would arrive in front of witnesses, and that mattered because the street that had been turned into a courtroom of opinion was about to hear a very different account of who truly had the authority to decide where I belonged. I stayed where I was because standing up too soon would have looked like retreat, and leaving would have given my parents exactly what they wanted, a clean ending they could explain away later. So I sat on the edge of my open suitcase and let the heat soak through the thin fabric of my slacks, feeling the grit of the driveway under my palms, and I focused on breathing evenly the way I had learned to do years earlier when my father would pace the kitchen late at night, with his voice rising and falling like a storm that never quite broke. Because calm was not something I had been born with. It was something I had practiced until it became a shield, and as I sat there, I could hear the neighborhood shifting again, the scrape of shoes on concrete. The low murmur of a conversation cut short when I glanced up the subtle choreography of curiosity, and I understood that every eye on me was waiting for a cue, a sign of weakness or resolve that would decide how this story would be told later. And I decided then that if this was going to be remembered, it would not be remembered as the day I begged to be let back inside. It would be remembered as the day I did not. And that decision settled into me with a surprising steadiness, because for the first time, I was not trying to predict my parents' reactions or soften their anger. I was simply waiting for something that had already been set in motion, and I knew that confused them, because confusion is what control looks like when it starts to slip. And I could almost picture my father on the other side of the door, checking the locks again, pacing the entryway, telling my mother that I would leave soon, that I always did, and my mother would have nodded and agreed, and told him not to worry that I had nowhere else to go. And the truth was that I did have somewhere to go, just not in the way they imagined. And as the minutes passed, I felt the weight of years pressing up against this moment. Years of being told to wait my turn, to be patient, to understand that family came first, even when family meant swallowing fear and silence. And I thought about how often I had been asked to lower my voice, to stop provoking, to apologize for things I did not do, and how often that advice had been framed as love. And sitting there now, I realized that this calm was not passive at all. It was deliberate because panic would have been easy, but patience required intention, and when my phone vibrated softly in my hand with a notification from the call I had made earlier, a simple confirmation that he was on his way, I did not look around or announce it. I simply locked the screen and placed the phone face down on my knee, and that small gesture felt like a pivot point because it meant I was no longer waiting for my parents to change their minds. I was waiting for the truth to arrive. And the difference between those two things is something I wish I had learned sooner. And a few neighbors noticed the shift, even if they could not name it, because something about my stillness became less uncertain and more intentional, and Mrs. Parker finally lowered her phone completely and folded her arms. And Mr. Collins straightened up from the mailbox, and a woman I did not recognize stepped closer to the edge of her lawn, as if she wanted to hear better, and I realized then that calm can be unsettling to people who expect chaos. And that unsettled feeling began to ripple outward, touching even the front window, where the curtain twitched again more sharply this time. And I imagined my mother trying to read my face for clues, for signs of fear or desperation she could interpret and manage, and finding none, because my face felt strangely neutral. Not blank, but composed in a way that came from certainty rather than numbness. And I thought briefly about all the times I had been told that my composure was cold or ungrateful, that I should show more emotion to prove I cared, and it occurred to me now that those demands had never been about connection. They had been about leverage, because emotion can be used against you, and calm cannot. And as another car slowed at the end of the block and then rolled on when nothing dramatic happened, I checked the time once more and felt a quiet resolve settle in, because I knew that when he arrived, it would not be with raised voices or threats. It would be with paper and procedure and words that did not bend to intimidation, and that knowledge anchored me more firmly than any apology ever had. And as the sun edged lower and the air cooled just enough to raise goosebumps along my arms, I remained seated, breathing slowly, letting the scene hold, because sometimes the strongest response is not to react at all, but to wait for the moment when reaction is no longer necessary. And I understood with absolute clarity that the silence I was offering now was not submission. It was preparation, in that whatever came next would not need my anger to carry it forward, because it would stand on its own, witnessed by everyone who had gathered to see how this would end. While I waited on the driveway, the past pressed forward with a clarity that surprised me, because moments like this have a way of stripping away the noise and leaving only patterns. and the pattern of my family had always been control wrapped in concern and anger, justified as discipline, and I could trace it back to when I was a child standing at the end of the hallway listening to my father Robert Young argue with my mother. Linda Young in low, urgent voices that carried through the walls anyway, his words sharp and precise, hers soft and placating, and even then I learned that the house ran on an unspoken rule, that his temper set the boundaries and her silence enforced them, and I learned early how to stay small, how to read the air in a room before I spoke, how to anticipate when a slammed cabinet meant plates would soon follow because although my father did not always hit, he made sure everyone knew he could. And the threat of that possibility hung over every disagreement like a shadow, and my mother would step in afterward and smooth things over, telling me he was under stress, telling me not to take it personally, telling me that families stuck together even when things got difficult, and those words were repeated so often they began to sound like facts rather than choices, and by the time I was a teenager, I understood that questioning them only made things worse. Because questioning was labeled disrespect, and disrespect was something my father did not tolerate, especially when it came from me. And I remember one night in particular when I was 16 and came home late from my shift at the grocery store, tired and smelling like cleaning solution, and my father accused me of thinking I was better than everyone else because I had a job and opinions, and when I tried to explain, he knocked a chair over so hard it cracked against the wall, and I froze the way I always did, my heart racing while my mother told me quietly to go to my room, and later she brought me a glass of water and told me I should not push him, that he worried about me, that his anger meant he cared, and it took me years to understand how dangerous that lesson was because it taught me to confuse fear with love. And as I sat on the driveway now, I could see how that same logic had followed me into adulthood, shaping every interaction, every demand for obedience framed as concern, every punishment framed as protection. And when my younger brother Ethan was born, the dynamic hardened because suddenly there was someone else to shield. Someone else whose needs could be prioritized without question, and my role became clearer. I was the one expected to adapt, to be resilient, to absorb discomfort, so the family could function, and whenever my father lost his temper or my mother made excuses for him, the explanation always came back to the same place. Do not upset the balance. Do not cause trouble. Do not make things harder than they already are, and I carried that with me long after I moved out. Long after I built a life that did not depend on their approval, and yet they never fully released their grip because control does not always require proximity. Sometimes it only requires the belief that it still exists, and that belief was what they were testing. Now, throwing my things outside, changing the locks, daring me to accept their version of events. And I understood with a painful clarity that this was not about one argument or one decision. It was about a lifetime of conditioning that told them I would eventually fold, that I would apologize, that I would come back inside and accept whatever terms they set, because that was how it had always ended before. And sitting there with the sun on my face and the weight of my history pressing in, I realized how much energy I had spent trying to be reasonable in an unreasonable system, and how little it had ever protected me, and the thought made my chest tighten, not with fear, but with a deep, steady anger that did not need to be expressed to be real, because anger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply clarifies what you are no longer willing to tolerate, and I could see now that my parents had mistaken my endurance for consent, and my silence for agreement, and my calm for weakness, and that miscalculation had brought us all to this moment with my belongings on the lawn and the neighborhood watching and my parents inside convinced they still held the final word. And the irony was that the very behaviors they had relied on for decades, intimidation, manipulation, the quiet rewriting of events were the same behaviors that had prompted a different kind of preparation long before this day arrived. Preparation they never noticed because it did not look like defiance, it looked like distance. And as I sat there remembering the slammed doors and the careful apologies and the years of being told to understand, I knew that understanding had finally reached its limit, and that whatever papers were making their way toward this house now existed because someone else had seen the pattern too and decided it needed to stop. And that knowledge steadied me as I waited, because it meant this was not a sudden break. It was the result of a long overdue reckoning, one that had been set in motion quietly, deliberately, and without the need for raised voices. And as the street remained hushed and the front door stayed closed, I let that realization settle fully, knowing that the roots of this moment ran deep, and that when they finally surfaced, they would not be easy for anyone inside that house to ignore. Thinking about the roots of our family always led back to the same imbalance, and that imbalance had a name: Ethan Young, my younger brother by 4 years, 24. Now, the child my parents described as sensitive, gifted, and in constant need of protection, and the contrast between us was never spoken aloud as favoritism. It was framed as necessity, as logic, as fairness, twisted just enough to sound reasonable. And I learned early that whatever Ethan needed would be provided first, and whatever remained might be offered to me if I asked carefully enough. And even then, there would be conditions, because my parents believed that struggle built character, at least when it was mine. And I can still see the day Ethan turned 16 and a used sedan appeared in the driveway with a bow taped crookedly to the hood. My father clapping him on the back and telling him he had earned it, while my mother wiped away proud tears and talked about freedom and responsibility. And I stood there holding my grocery store apron after a long shift, listening as they discussed insurance and maintenance, knowing that when I turned 16, my gift had been a lecture about bus schedules and the value of independence. And when I asked later why the rules were different, my mother smiled and said Ethan needed encouragement while I was strong enough on my own, a compliment that felt like a dismissal, and it was always like that. Ethan was allowed to fail without consequence, while I was expected to succeed without support. And every time I pointed out the disparity, it was reframed as jealousy or immaturity, as if noticing patterns were a character flaw. And over the years, that pattern expanded beyond money into protection, because when Ethan broke curfew, it was explained away as stress. When he raised his voice, it was called passion. When he made mistakes, my parents circled around him, instinctively shielding him from criticism. While my smallest missteps were treated as evidence that I could not be trusted, and I remember one Thanksgiving when Ethan knocked over a chair during an argument, and my father laughed it off as boys being boys. But when I quietly pushed back against a comment about my career, my father leaned close enough for me to smell the coffee on his breath and told me not to embarrass him in front of family, his hand gripping the back of my chair just a little too tightly. And my mother later told me I should be more understanding because Ethan was under pressure, as if pressure were something I had never experienced. And sitting on the driveway now, I could see how that golden child dynamic had hardened into policy, into a justification for every decision they made, including this one. Because when my mother told me earlier that day that Ethan needed stability and that I would be fine on my own, she was not improvising. She was reciting a script she had perfected over decades, one that positioned my resilience as a resource they could spend freely and my vulnerability as an inconvenience. And it struck me then that this public eviction was not just about control. It was about reaffirming that hierarchy, about reminding both of us where we stood. Because if they could throw my belongings outside without consequence, it would reinforce the idea that I was expendable, and Ethan would see once again that he was protected, that the house and the family and the future were his by default. And I wondered briefly whether he was watching from somewhere inside, listening to the muffled sounds through the door, and if so, what he was feeling, fear perhaps, or relief that it was not him, or the familiar comfort of knowing that whatever happened, our parents would intervene on his behalf. And I realized with a dull ache that Ethan had never had to learn how to sit with uncertainty the way I had, because uncertainty had always been absorbed by me first. And as a result, he had grown accustomed to safety without understanding its source, and that dependence was its own kind of trap, one my parents had built without ever acknowledging the cost. And I could imagine my father telling him that this was necessary, that I had forced their hand, that loyalty required firmness. And I could imagine Ethan nodding along, because nodding along had always been rewarded, and the thought did not make me angry, so much as it made me tired of a dynamic that reduced my worth to how much discomfort I could absorb without complaint. And sitting there with my clothes spread out and the street watching, I understood that whatever happened next would disrupt that balance permanently, because systems built on favoritism do not collapse gently, they fracture. And when they do, the golden child often discovers that the protection they relied on was conditional all along, and that realization would come for Ethan eventually, whether he was ready for it or not. and the knowledge that I was no longer willing to play my assigned role settled into me with a quiet finality because I had spent enough of my life being strong for everyone else. And this moment, humiliating as it was, marked the first time that strength was no longer being demanded of me, but claimed by me. And as I waited for the sound of an approaching car, I knew that the hierarchy my parents had enforced for so long was about to face something it had never encountered before. A limit that could not be argued away or smoothed over, and that when it did, the truth about who had been protected and who had been sacrificed would finally be impossible to ignore. The longer I stayed seated on the driveway, the more my parents' frustration seeped through the walls of the house, because silence has a way of provoking people who rely on reaction to feel powerful, and I sensed it before I heard it in the sharp scrape of the front door unlocking again and the heavy thud of my father's footsteps as he stepped back onto the porch. His face flushed, not from the heat, but from irritation that had nowhere to land, and he did not look at me. At first, he looked at the neighbors, scanning the street with a practiced awareness of audience, because Robert Young always performed best when he knew others were watching, and he cleared his throat loudly as if to reclaim the space, then pointed down at my scattered belongings and announced that I needed to take my things and leave immediately, his voice carrying across the lawns with deliberate emphasis. And when no one responded and I did not move, the edge crept into his tone. Because compliance delayed is control questioned, and that was something he did not tolerate well, and he accused me then of making a scene of embarrassing the family of trying to manipulate the situation by sitting there like a victim. And the irony of those words nearly broke my composure, because manipulation had always flowed in the opposite direction in that house. But I said nothing, and my refusal to engage seemed to anger him more than any argument could have, because it left him without leverage, and he stepped down one stair and leaned forward, his hands braced on his knees, lowering his voice just enough to sound private while still being loud enough for the nearest neighbors to hear. And he warned me that I was on his property without permission, that he had every right to call the police if I did not leave, and that threat carried a familiar weight, because he had used it before in other contexts, dangling authority as a way to end discussion. And I felt the old instinct to placate rise briefly before I pushed it aside, reminding myself that fear had never protected me in the past, and my mother appeared behind him. Then, her hand resting lightly on his arm in a gesture that looked supportive but was designed to redirect him just enough to maintain the appearance of reason, and she addressed me in a calm, measured voice that was far more unsettling than his anger, telling me that I was overreacting, that this did not need to be dramatic, that I could take my things and go stay somewhere else for a while until everyone cooled down, and she emphasized the word, while as if exile were temporary and benevolent, and she added that Ethan was inside and upset, and that I needed to think about how my behavior affected him, and that familiar guilt was meant to land like a hook because invoking Ethan had always been her most effective tool. But it slid past me this time because I could see the pattern too clearly now. The way responsibility was always shifted downward, the way my discomfort was framed as a necessary sacrifice for family harmony, and I realized with a sudden clarity that what they were escalating was not the conflict but the narrative, because they were trying to reassert control by defining the terms, publicly painting me as unreasonable, and themselves as patient and concerned, and that realization strengthened my resolve. Because narratives collapse when facts arrive, and facts were on their way. And my father straightened abruptly when he realized I was still not responding, his jaw tightening as he snapped that if I did not move immediately, he would remove my things himself and leave them at the curb, and there was a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes, then not physical violence, but the readiness to push the situation further, to force a reaction. And I felt my pulse quicken even as I remained outwardly still, because escalation is frightening when you have lived under it before, and part of me measured the distance between us instinctively the way I always had, but another part of me remained anchored by the knowledge that this moment was being witnessed, that every word was being recorded, that the tools he relied on worked best in private, and the public nature of this confrontation constrained him, even as it fueled his anger, and that constraint was visible in the way he stopped himself from stepping closer, glancing instead at the phones still raised along the street. And my mother must have noticed it too, because she tightened her grip on his arm and murmured something meant to sound soothing. And for a moment, the three of us stood there in a strange tableau. My parents on the porch, asserting authority they believed they still possessed, and me on the driveway refusing to validate it, and I could feel the tension pulling tight like a wire. Because this was the point where things usually tipped where I would apologize or comply, and the imbalance would be restored, and the fact that it was not happening now unsettled them deeply. And as my father turned away abruptly and stomped back inside, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, I knew that the escalation had reached its limit because there was nothing more he could do without crossing a line. He was unwilling to cross in front of witnesses, and as the house fell quiet again and the street held its breath, I remained seated, my heart pounding but my posture unchanged, aware that the pressure had shifted once more, and that whatever came next would not be driven by anger or intimidation, but by something far less flexible and far more final. I did not learn how to prepare quietly by accident. I learned it because noise in my family had always been punished and survival depended on doing important things without drawing attention to them. And that lesson took root years earlier when I began spending more time at my grandmother Margaret Young home after school, a small place with creaking floors and a kitchen that smelled like lemon cleaner and old books where the television stayed off and conversations happened slowly. And Margaret was the first adult who watched the way my father spoke to me and did not excuse it, who noticed how my shoulders tensed before his footsteps reached the hallway, who saw how my mother smoothed things over and called it peace, and she never confronted them directly because she understood something they did not. That confrontation would only harden their behavior, so instead she taught me how to protect myself in ways that looked ordinary from the outside, and it started with questions, quiet ones asked over tea, about where important papers were kept, about whose name appeared on which documents, about how decisions were made when no one was watching, and when I was younger, I thought she was simply being cautious in the way older people are. But as I grew older, I realized she was teaching me how to see the structure beneath the surface, and she did it without drama, without warning me explicitly, just guiding me to pay attention. And one afternoon when I was 21, she asked me to sit with her at the dining table and handed me a folder that contained copies of records I had never seen before. Deeds, statements, old correspondence, and she told me calmly that families sometimes confuse control with care, and that when that happens, it is wise to make sure the future cannot be decided by temper. And her words stayed with me because they named something I had felt but never articulated. And over the next several years, she continued that education in subtle ways, pointing out patterns, reminding me to keep my own records, encouraging me to build a life that did not rely on permission, and when she passed away unexpectedly, I grieved not just the loss of her presence, but the loss of the only person who had consistently validated what I experienced without minimizing it. And after the funeral, my parents spoke warmly about her generosity and legacy, and I listened quietly aware of how selectively they framed their relationship with her, and it was after that loss that my preparation became more intentional, because grief has a way of sharpening priorities, and I began to take steps that looked unremarkable to anyone else. Opening accounts in my own name, keeping duplicates of important documents, maintaining distance in conversations where control was being asserted, and I did all of it without announcing my reasons because announcing would have invited interference, and I knew from experience that interference would come dressed as concern, and there were moments when the urge to explain nearly broke through. Moments when my mother would press me for details about my plans or my finances with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and I would deflect politely because privacy had become my most reliable boundary, and looking back, I can see how that quiet preparation frustrated them long before today because control weakens when information stops flowing freely, and they sensed that shift, even if they could not name it, and it manifested in small comments about distance and independence and family loyalty. And my father grew more insistent whenever he felt that his authority was being bypassed, and my mother grew more subtle, probing for reassurance that I still needed them, and I gave neither of them what they were looking for. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. And the decision to keep my plans to myself was reinforced by moments of escalation that never quite crossed into physical harm but hovered close enough to keep me alert. A raised voice, a slammed door, a hand gripping a countertop too hard, and each of those moments reminded me that safety in that family was conditional and conditional. Safety is not safety at all. And so I learned to prepare in ways that did not trigger suspicion, to make arrangements that could withstand scrutiny, to trust processes over promises. And as I sat on the driveway now with my belongings exposed to the street, I recognized that this moment had been anticipated long before it arrived. Not in its exact form, but in its inevitability, because families built on control do not tolerate autonomy indefinitely. And the fact that my parents had chosen to escalate publicly rather than privately told me they believed they still held the advantage, that they believed exposure would force me back into compliance. And that belief existed only because they did not know what had already been set in motion. And I felt a strange gratitude then for the patience my grandmother had modeled, for the way she had taught me that preparation does not need to be loud to be effective, that sometimes the most powerful work is done quietly over time. And as I waited for the sound of the car she told me would matter when it arrived, I understood that this was not a gamble. It was the final step in a process that had begun years ago, guided by someone who had seen the pattern clearly and refused to let it continue. Unchecked, and the calm I felt now was not denial or shock. It was recognition, because I knew that whatever papers were about to be presented would not be a surprise to me, only to the people who had assumed I would never be ready, and that assumption was the last and most dangerous mistake they would make. I checked the time again and then stopped checking, because waiting has a way of stretching when you measure it too closely, and I did not want impatience to undo the calm I had worked so hard to keep. So I let my focus narrow to simple things: the warmth of the concrete through my clothes, the faint smell of cut grass from a neighbor yard, the distant sound of traffic beyond the subdivision, and the way the afternoon light shifted slowly across the front of the house, as if nothing extraordinary were happening at all. And that contrast between the ordinary and the momentous steadied me, because it reminded me that this was not a crisis unfolding at random, but a sequence reaching its next step. And as I sat there, the neighborhood settled into a strange pause. People no longer moving, but not leaving either, as if instinct told them something unresolved was still coming, and I noticed small details I might have missed otherwise. The way Mr. Collins crossed his arms and leaned back against his mailbox instead of pretending to sort mail, the way Mrs. Parker whispered to someone just out of frame, and then looked back at me with a different expression than before. Less curiosity and more uncertainty. And uncertainty is powerful because it cracks assumptions, and I could feel those assumptions beginning to crack now. Because the story my parents were counting on required me to leave, required a clear ending where I drove away and the street returned to normal, and the longer I remained seated there, the less convincing that story became. And I imagined my parents inside pacing and recalculating, my father insisting that I would go soon, and my mother urging patience, both of them clinging to the idea that time was on their side. And I understood then that waiting was not passive, it was strategic, because time changes the balance when one side expects immediate compliance, and I had learned that lesson well. And as the minutes passed, I felt the old anxiety try to surface, the voice that whispered that maybe I should just leave to avoid further escalation, that maybe this was too much attention, too many eyes, too much risk. And I acknowledged that voice without letting it steer, because that voice had kept me small for years, and it did not get to decide anymore. And instead, I reminded myself of the preparation that had led here, of the steps taken quietly and deliberately, of the conversations that had happened away from this house and beyond my parents' reach, and those reminders anchored me more firmly than reassurance ever could. And a car turned onto our street, then slowing as it approached, and I felt a brief flicker of anticipation before it passed by, and continued on, and the flicker faded without disappointment, because I knew this was not a race, and rushing would only betray the confidence I needed to project. And I noticed then that the curtain in the front window had not moved in some time, and that absence was telling, because my mother was rarely still when outcomes were uncertain. And I wondered whether she had retreated deeper into the house to make calls of her own, to test whether any authority she trusted would confirm her version of events. And the thought made me almost smile, because authority that relies on reassurance is already unstable. And I returned my attention to the street as another neighbor stepped out onto their porch, drawn by the lingering tension, and the crowd expanded slightly, not loudly, but noticeably, and I realized that whatever happened next would not just be witnessed, it would be remembered, because communities remember disruptions to the narrative they rely on. and this disruption was unfolding slowly enough to embed itself. And as the sun dipped lower and the air cooled, I felt a strange sense of ownership over the moment. Not ownership of the house or the driveway, but ownership of my own presence within it, because for once I was not trying to minimize myself to preserve peace, and that realization brought a quiet relief that surprised me because it meant I no longer needed my parents' approval to stand where I was standing. And when another car turned onto the street and slowed more deliberately, this time I lifted my head slightly. Not in hope, but in readiness, because readiness is different from expectation. And as the vehicle approached and then pulled over near the curb, I felt the waiting settle into something else, something complete, because the pause had served its purpose, and the balance that had once favored intimidation and assumption had shifted, and whatever stepped out of that car would do so into a space already reshaped by silence, observation, and the simple refusal to be moved before the truth arrived. The car that stopped at the curb did not announce itself in any dramatic way. There were no flashing lights or abrupt movements, just a quiet sedan pulling in smoothly as if it belonged there, and that ordinariness drew every remaining eye on the street toward it at once. Because after so much waiting, even something simple felt significant, and I stood up slowly for the first time since my parents had closed the door, brushing dust from my slacks with deliberate care, aware that every movement would be noticed and interpreted. And the driver door opened and a man stepped out who did not look like what my parents would have expected authority to look like. He was middle-aged, maybe in his late 50s, wearing a plain jacket and holding a thin leather folder under one arm. His posture relaxed but purposeful, and he glanced down the street once before his eyes found me, immediately. Not with curiosity or pity, but with recognition, and he walked toward me without hesitation. And that detail mattered more than anything else because it told me he knew exactly who he was here for, and the murmurs that had been drifting through the neighborhood quieted as he approached phones, lifting again almost automatically, and I could feel the shift in attention as clearly as a change in temperature. Because this was no longer just a family dispute playing out in public, it had acquired a new gravity, and when the man stopped a few feet in front of me, he introduced himself calmly, using my full name, Avery Young, as if to anchor the moment in something formal and unarguable, and I nodded in response without offering my hand, because this was not a social interaction, it was procedural, and he did not ask me how I was or comment on the scene around us. He simply asked if this was the residence listed in his file, and when I confirmed it, he thanked me and turned toward the house without another word, and the decisiveness of that movement sent a ripple through the crowd, because people are quick to sense when control is changing hands, and this man moved like someone who was not seeking permission, and I followed a few steps behind him, not rushing, not lagging, just present. And as we reached the front walkway, he paused and adjusted the folder under his arm, and I noticed then that his hands were steady, practiced the hands of someone accustomed to delivering information that altered lives, and he rang the doorbell once firmly, and the sound cut through the quiet street more sharply than any shout could have. And there was a brief pause before the door opened, and when my father appeared in the doorway, his expression shifted from irritation to confusion in a fraction of a second because this was not a neighbor or a police officer or anyone he recognized as part of his usual network of influence, and confusion is a fragile state for people who rely on certainty, and my father demanded to know who the man was and what he wanted. His voice pitched to Carrie still performing for the street, but the man did not respond to the tone, only to the question, and he introduced himself by name and title in a calm, even voice that did not rise to meet my father's aggression, and he asked to speak with the legal occupants of the residence, and the phrasing was precise enough that I saw my mother's face appear behind my father instantly, her eyes narrowing as she tried to parse what was being said because precision disrupts manipulation. And my father laughed once sharply and said that this was his house and that no appointment had been made, and the man acknowledged the statement without agreeing to it, simply opening his folder and removing a document, and the sight of paper in his hands changed the atmosphere immediately because paper carries weight in a way words do not. And he explained calmly that he was there to deliver and read a set of documents related to the property and that he was authorized to do so on site. And my father bristled and began to object, but the man raised one hand slightly not to silence him but to indicate process, and he said that the matter would take only a few minutes. and that the contents of the documents would clarify any misunderstandings, and the word misunderstandings landed like a challenge, because my parents had always relied on ambiguity to maintain control, and here was someone offering clarity instead. And my mother stepped forward, then forcing a polite smile and asking whether this could be handled privately. Her voice carefully modulated, and the man replied that the documents were a matter of public record and that reading them aloud ensured accuracy. And I saw the calculation flicker across her face. The realization that whatever was coming could not be contained once it was spoken, and my father hesitated, his gaze darting briefly toward the street where phones were still raised and neighbors stood frozen in place. And in that hesitation, I saw the first crack in the certainty he had carried all afternoon, because for the first time he was not controlling the audience or the narrative. And as the man adjusted his stance and prepared to begin, I took one step closer, positioning myself where I could hear every word clearly, and I felt the culmination of the waiting settle over me, not as relief, but as focus, because this was the moment when assumption would give way to record, when intimidation would be replaced by documentation. And as the man drew a breath to speak, the street fell completely silent, as if everyone present understood instinctively that whatever was about to be read would end the story my parents had been telling for years and replace it with one they could no longer deny. The man did not rush, and that alone shifted the balance in a way my parents could not immediately counter, because Robert Young had always relied on speed and volume to dominate a situation on pressing forward before anyone could think clearly. But this stranger moved at a pace that suggested time was on his side, and he began by stating his name and his role in a tone so even it felt almost detached from the tension around us, explaining that he was acting as an authorized legal representative connected to the property at this address. And the word authorized landed heavily because it implied a chain of authority that did not include my parents' consent. And I watched my father's jaw tighten as he demanded again to know who had sent him, his voice sharp with irritation, now edged by something closer to alarm. And the man answered simply that his obligation was to the record, not to personal explanations, and that if my parents wished to dispute the contents, they could do so through appropriate channels later, but that his task at this moment was to deliver notice and read it aloud to ensure proper receipt. And my mother stepped forward, then her hand resting lightly against my father's arm, attempting to slow him while maintaining the appearance of composure, and she asked in her calm, measured voice whether this could be done inside, away from the street, away from all the attention. And the man looked past her briefly at the gathered neighbors and then back at the door and replied that delivery at the point of access was standard when questions of occupancy and possession were involved, and that the presence of witnesses ensured clarity, and the phrase presence of witnesses made something in my mother's expression falter, because witnesses were useful only when you controlled the story, and this was no longer their story to tell. And my father scoffed and said loudly that there was no dispute about occupancy because this was his house and had been for decades. And the man nodded once as if acknowledging a common misconception, and then opened the folder, fully revealing several pages clipped neatly together, and the sight of those documents drew the neighbors closer without anyone realizing they had moved, because paper has a gravity of its own. And he began by reading the property address in full, including the lot number and county designation, his voice clear and unhurried. And as he continued through the formal language, I could see my father trying to interrupt, trying to reassert himself with dismissive comments and raised eyebrows, but each attempt died out quickly because the man did not pause to respond, and that refusal to engage was disarming in a way. Shouting never could be, and when he reached the section that identified the controlling instrument, my mother's breath caught audibly, because even without legal training she recognized the language of permanence. And my father demanded to see the papers, holding out his hand as if taking possession of them would restore control. But the man declined politely, stating that copies would be provided after the reading, and that the originals were to remain in his custody, and that small boundary was enough to push my father closer to the edge. Because boundaries are what control fears most, and I felt the weight of the moment settle as the man continued naming the trust by its full legal title, and stating the date on which it had been executed, and recorded a date that made my parents exchange a quick glance, because it predated several decisions they had made with complete confidence, and he explained that the trust was irrevocable, using the word slowly as if to ensure it was heard, and that it designated a single beneficiary and trustee, and I watched as my mother instinctively looked toward the house as if searching for an explanation she could manage, and when the man read my name in that role, the street seemed to inhale all at once, because even those who did not understand the legal details understood the significance of naming, and my father reacted immediately, his voice rising as he declared it impossible, and accused the man of making a mistake, insisting that his mother would never have done such a thing without telling them. And the man acknowledged the reaction without validating it, explaining that the documents had been properly executed with counsel and recorded with the county, and that notice was not required to be provided to removed parties at the time of execution, and my father's face drained of color, then not all at once but in stages because each sentence stripped away another assumption he had relied on, and my mother tried to regain footing by appealing to reason, suggesting there must be context, that family intentions mattered, that this could be discussed privately and corrected, and the man responded with a quiet firmness that context did not override. Record, and that correction was not possible under the terms described, and as he spoke, I felt something shift inside me, not triumph but confirmation, because the words matched what I had been prepared for, and I realized that the power of this moment did not come from surprise, but from inevitability, from the fact that the process unfolding now did not depend on my parents' agreement or understanding. And as the man reached the end of the summary and paused, the silence that followed was different from the earlier waiting. It was heavier, more final, because authority had been established not through force or volume, but through structure, and the structure did not bend. And my parents stood on the porch staring at the documents as if they might rearrange themselves into something less threatening, and I understood then that the stranger had not arrived to argue or negotiate or intimidate. He had arrived to replace assumption with fact, and that replacement was already complete. The moment my name was read aloud as the sole beneficiary and trustee, something irreversible settled over the porch because even for those who did not understand the legal mechanics, the meaning was clear enough. Authority had shifted, and my parents were no longer the ones holding it, and my father reacted first, the way he always did when his certainty was challenged by trying to overwhelm it, raising his voice and insisting that none of this could be valid because he had lived in this house for years, because he had paid bills, because he had maintained the property, because family did not operate this way, and each reason spilled out faster than the last, as if volume could reassert ownership, and the man listened without interruption until the words ran out on their own, and then he responded calmly that residency and maintenance did not override recorded ownership, that payment of expenses did not confer control when those expenses were incurred without legal title, and that family relationships did not nullify instruments executed under the law, and I saw the muscles in my father's neck tighten as he tried to process a reality that did not align with his expectations, because he had always believed that effort equaled entitlement, and entitlement equaled authority. And this structure recognized none of that, and my mother stepped in then with a different approach, her voice softer, almost pleading, saying that there had to be some misunderstanding, that she and my father had cared for the house, that they had planned their lives around it, that they would never have acted as they did if they had known. And the man acknowledged the statement without sympathy or dismissal, simply explaining that the trust had been designed specifically to remove discretion from parties whose decisions could compromise the intended outcome, and that the intended outcome had been clearly articulated at the time of execution. And when he said that, my mother's composure faltered because she understood what was being implied, that someone else had seen their behavior clearly enough to plan around it, and that someone else had not trusted them with flexibility, and the man continued by explaining in precise language that as trustee, I had full legal authority over occupancy and access effective immediately, and that any actions taken earlier in the day to deny me entry had no standing under the trust. And that phrase, effective immediately, landed with visible impact because it meant there was no waiting period, no appeal window, no opportunity to regain footing through delay. And my father laughed sharply again, a brittle sound, and said that if that were true, I would have already known that no one would leave something like this to surprise, And the man responded that notice to the beneficiary had been properly documented, and that any failure to recognize it did not negate its existence. And I felt a subtle tightening in my chest then as the words aligned with memories I had kept private conversations that had happened quietly, preparations that had been made without spectacle. And I realized that what my parents were experiencing now was not betrayal, but exposure. The exposure of an assumption they had never questioned, that I would never be prepared to stand outside their authority. And as the man offered to provide copies of the documents, my father reached for them again, and this time his hand shook noticeably. And when he read the first page, his eyes scanned too quickly, skimming for reassurance that was not there. And my mother leaned in to read over his shoulder, her lips moving silently as she took in each line, and the street felt impossibly quiet, as if the neighbors sensed that this was no longer entertainment but consequence, unfolding in real time. And my brother Ethan appeared then in the doorway behind my parents, drawn by the raised voices and the sudden stillness that followed them. And when he saw me standing there with the man and the documents, his expression shifted from confusion to something like fear, because he had never seen our parents without answers before. And the man acknowledged his presence only by noting that occupancy questions extended to all current residents and that arrangements would be addressed formally in due course. And that statement was enough to make Ethan step back instinctively, because it implied that his position was not as secure as he had always assumed. And my father snapped that this was outrageous, that it was an ambush, that no one had the right to show up and rewrite his life without warning, and the man corrected him gently, stating that nothing was being rewritten, only enforced, and that enforcement often feels sudden to those who have not been paying attention, and those words cut deeper than any accusation could have, because they named the truth of the moment without drama. And as the man summarized the key points, again for clarity, ownership vested in the trust authority, vested in the trustee, denial of access invalid. I felt the weight of years lift incrementally, not all at once, but enough to change how I stood, because this was not about winning an argument. It was about being recognized by a system that did not rely on intimidation or hierarchy. And as the reading concluded and the man closed the folder, the silence that followed was absolute, heavy with realization, because the first twist was complete. The house my parents had used as leverage, as threat, as proof of dominance, no longer belonged to the narrative they had constructed around it, and that truth could not be shouted down or negotiated away. It had been recorded, and it had arrived. The first reaction after the papers were read was not anger, but denial, the kind that surfaces when a reality threatens the foundation someone has relied on for too long. And my father stood there gripping the edge of the doorframe as if the house itself might steady him, insisting again that there had to be a mistake, that documents could be misfiled, that lawyers could be wrong, that nothing written on paper could erase decades of living in a place he considered his. And he spoke quickly now, stacking explanations on top of one another, telling the man that families handle these things internally, that airing them in public was unnecessary and cruel, and that if there were concerns, they could be resolved through discussion, like reasonable people, and the word reasonable echoed oddly in the quiet street, because nothing about what had happened earlier that day had been reasonable, and yet he clung to it as if invoking the concept might summon it into existence. And my mother followed with her own version of denial, softer but no less determined, stepping forward with a practiced expression of concern and saying that everyone was emotional, that things had escalated too quickly, that no one should make permanent decisions based on a single bad day. And she looked directly at me. Then, for the first time since the reading began, her eyes searching my face for the familiar signs of hesitation. She had learned to read so well, and she told me gently that this was not what my grandmother would have wanted, that Margaret valued family above all else, that she would never have intended for her legacy to divide us this way. And hearing my grandmother's name used as a shield tightened something in my chest, because I knew how carefully that legacy had been constructed, how intentionally it had been protected, and the man responded to my mother's appeal without emotion, stating that the trust document included a letter of intent that clearly outlined the grantor's reasoning, and that the purpose had been to prevent exactly this kind of pressure from influencing outcomes. And my mother's mouth opened slightly as if to protest before closing again, because denial weakens when confronted with specificity, and my father shifted tactics then, turning toward the neighbors and raising his voice as if to gather support, asking rhetorically whether this seemed fair, whether it made sense for a child to take a parent's home, whether anyone would tolerate being treated this way after years of sacrifice, and a few people shifted uncomfortably. But no one answered because fairness sounds different when facts are present, and I realized then that my father was not asking for judgment. He was asking for validation, and validation was no longer available to him, and the absence of it unsettled him more than opposition would have. And my brother Ethan stepped forward tentatively, then his face pale, and asked what this meant for him, whether he was expected to leave too, and my mother reached for his arm, immediately pulling him slightly behind her, as if to shield him from the implications, and the man explained calmly that occupancy arrangements would be addressed formally, and that notice would be provided according to procedure, and that no one was being removed at this moment beyond the clarification of authority. And my father's shoulders sagged slightly at that, because delay offered him something to grasp, and he seized on it, saying that if nothing was happening immediately, then there was time to sort this out, time to consult his own attorney, time to challenge whatever needed to be challenged. And he looked at me with a mix of accusation and expectation, as if waiting for me to confirm that this was a misunderstanding that could be undone. And for a brief moment, the old impulse to smooth things over surfaced, the reflex to minimize conflict for the sake of peace. And I felt its pull precisely because it had been cultivated for so long. But that impulse did not control me anymore, and I said nothing because silence was no longer avoidance. It was alignment with the truth that had just been established, and the man clarified then that while legal challenges were always an option, the trust provisions were clear and the likelihood of reversal was minimal, and that in the meantime, compliance with its terms was required, including restoration of access to the trustee. And that statement drew my father's attention back to the locks he had changed earlier, and for the first time that day, I saw uncertainty flicker into fear on his face. Because denial can persist only until consequences begin to outline themselves, and my mother sensed it too, stepping in quickly to propose compromises, suggesting that we all take a step back, that emotions had run high, that perhaps we could share the space temporarily while things were reviewed, and her suggestions were delivered with the same tone she had used my entire life, calm and reasonable, and designed to sound like the middle ground. And the man responded by explaining that shared occupancy without the trustee's consent was not permissible under the trust, and that any temporary arrangements would need to be initiated by me, not assumed by others, and the implication was unmistakable. Control had shifted fully, and the denial that had fueled their confidence moments earlier began to collapse under the weight of process, because process does not negotiate with feelings, and as my parents exchanged glances and searched for a way to reframe what was happening, I understood that this stage of denial was necessary not for me, but for them, because it marked the moment when they realized that this was not a misunderstanding to be corrected, but a reality to be faced. And the fact that they had no language prepared for that realization made it all the more stark, because for the first time they were not setting the terms or defining the narrative. They were reacting to it, and denial, once exposed, has very little room left to operate. The moment that changed everything did not come from another page being read or another rule being explained. It came when the man opened a second section of the folder and stated calmly that the trust included a written statement of purpose, because intent matters when consequences are questioned, and the word intent drew my parents' attention in a way nothing else had, because intent cannot be argued with volume or rewritten through explanation. It either exists or it does not. And as he began to read portions of that statement aloud, the temperature of the porch seemed to drop, because this was no longer about ownership or authority in the abstract. It was about behavior being observed and judged by someone my parents could not dismiss. And the statement explained in plain language that the trust had been established to protect the property from being used as leverage or punishment, and to ensure that no family member could be displaced through intimidation or control. And I watched my mother's face tighten as those words were spoken because they mirrored language she had used for years while insisting the opposite. And my father shook his head sharply and muttered that this was ridiculous, that his own mother would never accuse him of intimidation, and the man continued reading without acknowledging the interruption, stating that the grantor had expressed concern about escalating confrontations within the household and the use of fear as a means of enforcing compliance. And when the word fear was spoken, my father stiffened visibly because fear was the one thing he had always insisted did not exist in our home. That what others called fear was merely respect, and I felt a strange clarity settle over me as the statement continued because the language was not dramatic or accusatory. It was careful and restrained naming patterns rather than incidents describing control rather than conflict, and that restraint made it more powerful than any accusation could have been because it reflected exactly what I had lived without exaggeration. And the statement went on to explain that the trust was designed to remove discretion from individuals whose decisions were influenced by anger or favoritism, and to ensure that outcomes would not depend on emotional pressure or public humiliation. And when those words were read aloud, the street seemed to lean in collectively because the phrase public humiliation landed directly on what everyone had witnessed earlier that day. And my mother's hand flew briefly to her mouth before she composed herself, and my father took a step back as if struck not physically but morally because the timing was impossible to ignore, and for the first time since the confrontation began, I felt the weight of the narrative shift fully away from me, because this was no longer a dispute between parent and child. It was a record of concern, validated by action, and the man explained then that the trust had been structured deliberately to activate protections when access was denied or threats were made because the grantor believed that waiting for harm to escalate before intervening was unacceptable. And those words settled heavily because they reframed everything my parents had done that day, not as discipline or consequence, but as evidence that the safeguards were necessary, and my father reacted with outrage, then insisting that this was an insult, that his character was being attacked, that a few raised voices did not constitute abuse, and the man responded with a calm statement that the trust did not require abuse to be proven, only risk to be mitigated, and that distinction cut through the room like a blade because it exposed the flaw in my father's defense. The belief that harm only counted once it crossed an obvious line, and my mother tried to salvage the moment by appealing to intent of her own, saying that everything they had done was out of love, that families argue that boundaries shift, and that no one should have their life upended over misunderstandings, and the man acknowledged that families argue, but clarified that the trust was not a punishment. It was a boundary. And boundaries exist precisely because love does not always prevent harm, and that sentence echoed in the quiet street long after it was spoken, because it named the truth I had struggled to articulate for years, that love declared without safety enforced is not protection, it is permission. And as the reading concluded, the man summarized that the moral purpose of the trust was inseparable from its legal function, that the two reinforced each other by design, and that any attempt to override one would undermine the other. And my parents stood frozen as that realization settled because they had always relied on moral language to soften their actions, to frame control as care and punishment as guidance. And here, that language had been reclaimed and redirected not by me, but by a document that existed because someone else had seen the pattern clearly enough to intervene, and I felt a surge of emotion then that I did not express outwardly, not triumph or vindication, but a deep, steady relief. Because for the first time, the moral weight of my experience had been acknowledged without requiring me to relive it or justify it, and the street remained silent as the man closed the folder, because everyone present understood instinctively that this was not just a legal turning point, but an ethical one, a moment where behavior had been named and boundaries had been drawn without shouting or spectacle. And as my parents stood there searching for words that would restore the old balance, I understood that the moral authority they had wielded for decades had just been replaced by something they could not manipulate, and that replacement was permanent. As the man shifted the folder in his hands, I sensed another turn coming, not because of his expression, but because of the way my parents' bodies tightened in anticipation. the way people do when they realize the first blow was not the last, and he explained calmly that the trust included a compliance provision designed to activate automatically when certain actions occurred, not as punishment, but as protection, and that provision applied when access to the property was denied to the trustee through physical barriers or threats. And as he spoke those words, my father glanced instinctively toward the door, and then at the new locks he had installed that morning with such confidence, and the man continued by stating that changing the locks without authorization constituted an unlawful denial of access under the trust terms, and that this action triggered a secondary process designed to document risk and prevent further escalation. And the phrase secondary process sounded abstract until he clarified what it meant, that a report had already been generated and transmitted to the appropriate oversight bodies as a matter of record, documenting the denial of access and the circumstances under which it occurred. And my mother's breath caught sharply then, because she understood what my father did not yet fully grasp, that automatic processes do not wait for permission or intent. They simply execute. And my father demanded to know what oversight bodies meant, his voice rising again as if volume might slow what had already begun. And the man replied that the trust included a requirement to notify relevant authorities when actions suggested financial or custodial misuse of a protected asset, and that the notification did not presume guilt but ensured transparency, and the word transparency hung in the air because it was the opposite of how my parents preferred to operate. And he went on to explain that the report flagged the property for review to ensure that no improper use or misrepresentation had occurred in connection with the trust, and that such reviews were routine when access disputes arose. And my father scoffed at first, dismissing it as meaningless bureaucracy, but his confidence wavered as the man added that the review process included examination of prior statements and representations made regarding the property, including any financial benefits derived from it after the trust had been recorded, and I watched the color drain from my father's face as he began to calculate implications he had never considered, because he had always assumed that the house existed outside scrutiny protected by family privacy and tradition, and my mother stepped in quickly. Then her voice tight as she asked whether this could be stopped, whether the report could be withdrawn now that the misunderstanding had been clarified. And the man responded that the process was automatic and could not be reversed, that its purpose was to create a record precisely because disputes tend to escalate when unchecked, and that early documentation prevented greater harm later, and those words landed with a finality that no argument could soften, because prevention does not negotiate with regret. And my brother Ethan looked between my parents in confusion and fear, asking quietly what this meant for them, and my mother hushed him instinctively, but the fear was already spreading because this twist did not rely on my choices or emotions. It had been triggered by their actions alone, and my father tried one last time to assert control by questioning the legitimacy of the trust itself, suggesting fraud or coercion. But the man responded that the trust had been reviewed and validated at the time of execution, and that the compliance provisions were standard for assets placed at risk by internal conflict. And I realized then that the second twist was not just legal but structural, because it removed the possibility of negotiating behind closed doors, of reframing events privately to avoid consequence. And my parents stood there confronting a system that did not care about their explanations, only about their actions. And the street seemed to sense the shift as well, because the murmurs that followed were not curious but sober, the sound people make when they understand that something irreversible has begun. And I felt a steady calm settle over me, not because I wished harm on my parents, but because I recognized the justice in process, the fairness of rules applied without favoritism or fear. And the man concluded by stating that the immediate requirement was simple: access to the property must be restored to the trustee without delay, and any further interference would be documented as non-compliance. And my father stared at him in disbelief, as if waiting for a loophole to appear. But none did, and in that moment, the locks he had changed so proudly became evidence rather than leverage symbols of a choice that had consequences beyond humiliation or family argument. And as my mother reached for my father's arm with trembling fingers, I understood that this was the point of no return, not because of anger or revenge, but because a line had been crossed and recorded, and the system designed to protect me had done exactly what it was meant to do, quietly and decisively. And as the man stepped back slightly to give space for compliance, the power my parents had relied on for so long, dissolved not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the steady presence of consequences they could not talk their way out of. The collapse did not happen all at once. The way anger does, it happened in layers, as understanding replaced denial and fear replaced outrage, and I watched it unfold across my parents' faces with a strange sense of distance because I had seen pieces of it before in private moments, but never this exposed, never without a way for them to retreat into authority, and my father was the first to visibly falter, his shoulders lowering as if the weight of the house itself had finally settled on him, and he asked in a quieter voice what exactly was expected of him. Now, not as a challenge, but as a calculation, because control had always been his currency and he was trying to determine how much he had left. And the man answered simply that the locks must be changed back immediately and that access to the property must be restored to me as trustee, and that compliance would be noted, and that simplicity seemed to disorient my father more than confrontation would have, because there was no argument to engage with, only an action to perform, and my mother stepped in quickly, then, her composure cracking just enough to reveal panic beneath it, and she began apologizing in fragments. Not full apologies, but pieces of them saying this had gotten out of hand, that no one intended harm, that families make mistakes, and she looked at me again with a pleading expression that had once been effective. The look that asked me to rescue her from the consequences of her own choices. And for a moment, the old reflex stirred the desire to smooth things over, to reduce tension, but it faded as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the clarity that rescuing her would only reestablish the pattern that had brought us here, and I remained silent, and that silence forced her to continue speaking without reassurance. And the longer she did, the more fragmented her words became, until she stopped altogether, realizing that she was negotiating without leverage. And my brother Ethan reacted next, stepping forward with uncertainty etched across his face, and asking whether he needed to pack his things, his voice unsteady as he looked between our parents and me. And the question itself marked a shift because it was the first time he had acknowledged that the protection he relied on might not extend to him automatically, and my mother turned toward him instinctively, pulling him closer and telling him not to worry, that they would handle it. But her voice lacked conviction now, and the man clarified again that no one was being removed at that moment, only that authority had been clarified and access restored, and that further arrangements would be communicated formally, and that measured response did nothing to ease the tension because it did not offer reassurance. Only structure, and my father seemed to shrink slightly under that structure, his eyes darting from the man to the neighbors to the door as if searching for an exit that no longer existed, and the neighbors watched without comment, their presence no longer curious but somber, because this was not entertainment anymore, it was consequence. And I realized then that public humiliation cuts both ways, because the same audience my parents had relied on to shame me was now witnessing their loss of control, and that reversal carried its own weight, and my father finally nodded stiffly and said he would change the locks back. His voice flat, and he turned toward the door as if on autopilot, fumbling briefly with his keys before disappearing inside, and the sound of his footsteps retreating echoed through the house in a way that felt symbolic because for the first time he was moving in response to someone else. And my mother followed him halfway and then stopped, turning back toward me with a look that hovered between anger and fear. And she asked quietly whether this was really what I wanted, whether I understood what I was doing to the family, and the question landed differently than it once would have, because it no longer framed me as the source of harm, but revealed her expectation that I should absorb it, and I felt a steady resolve rise in me as I met her gaze and understood that answering would only reopen a negotiation that had already been settled by record and action, and so I said nothing, and that nothing forced her to confront the reality that I was no longer participating in the emotional labor that had sustained the imbalance, and she looked away. Then, her shoulders sagging as she turned back inside, and the door closed behind her with a finality that felt different from before, because this time it was not shutting me out. It was enclosing them in the consequences of their choices, and the man stepped slightly to the side, then giving me space, and told me that once access was restored, he would document compliance and follow up with written notices outlining next steps, and his tone remained steady throughout, neither sympathetic nor cold, just factual. and that steadiness underscored the collapse unfolding behind him. Because systems do not respond to emotion, they respond to action, and my parents had exhausted their options for avoiding both. And as we waited for the sound of the locks being changed back, I felt a strange mixture of relief and gravity. Because collapse is not victory, it is reckoning. And reckoning leaves everyone altered, and the house that had once felt like a tool of control now felt like a neutral structure waiting to be reclaimed. And I stood there in the quiet that followed, aware that this moment marked the end of one version of my family and the beginning of something far less comfortable but far more honest. And that honesty, however painful, was the only thing that could exist where fear once lived. The neighborhood did not erupt into noise or judgment the way I once imagined public moments did. Instead, it shifted into a quieter register that felt heavier, as if everyone present understood that what they were witnessing carried consequences beyond curiosity. And I could feel that weight in the way people adjusted their stance and lowered their phones, in the way conversations did not restart, but simply stopped, because there are moments when a crowd becomes a jury without being asked. And this was one of them. And the silence that followed my father retreating inside to change the locks was not supportive or hostile. It was evaluative, and that distinction mattered because evaluation replaces assumption when facts appear, and I watched faces change as understanding settled. Mrs. Parker no longer looked concerned for my well-being, but attentive to the process unfolding. Mr. Collins stood upright now with his arms at his sides rather than folded, and a few neighbors who had lingered at a distance stepped closer to the edges of their lawns, not to intrude, but to ensure they did not miss what came next. And I realized then that public humiliation is powerful only when it stands alone, when it is not followed by explanation or consequence. And what my parents had initiated earlier in the day had been a performance designed to isolate me, to position me as the problem, and that performance had now been overtaken by a different narrative, one grounded in record and procedure rather than accusation, and the shift was visible, because people recalibrate quickly when authority becomes clear, and authority here did not look like shouting or dominance. It looked like a man holding documents and a family being required to comply. And I noticed small details that would have escaped me before, the way one neighbor shook his head slowly, as if rethinking something he had assumed about my parents. The way another woman whispered something to her husband and then looked back at the house with narrowed eyes, and I understood that reputation is not lost in a single moment, but in the accumulation of moments that no longer align. And my parents had relied on the assumption that the neighborhood would see only what they presented. And now that assumption was dissolving, and the man beside me remained still, allowing the scene to breathe, because enforcement does not need commentary, and his presence anchored the moment. And I stood with my hands relaxed at my sides, aware that my posture mattered, because composure communicates credibility in ways words cannot, and I could feel the gaze of the street settle on me differently now. Not with pity or curiosity, but with a cautious respect that comes when people realize someone has endured more than they understood, and that realization made me acutely aware of how often families hide harm behind closed doors, relying on public image to shield private behavior, and how destabilizing it is when that shield cracks in front of witnesses and the sound of tools echoed faintly from inside the house. Then, the unmistakable clink of metal and turning screws as the locks were changed back, and that sound carried through the quiet street like a verdict being rendered, because it was tangible proof that authority had shifted, and a few neighbors exchanged looks as if to confirm they were hearing what they thought they were hearing. And I felt a strange steadiness settle over me, because this was no longer about my relationship with my parents. It was about accountability being enacted in real time, and that accountability did not require anyone to take my side. It required only that the facts be acknowledged, and the neighborhood was acknowledging them now, not through applause or condemnation, but through attention. And attention has a way of recording moments more accurately than commentary ever could. And as the minutes passed and the sound inside the house continued, I became aware of the way my parents' absence from the porch altered the dynamic, because without them present to frame the scene, the narrative defaulted to what people could observe, and what they could observe was a calm woman standing her ground and a legal process unfolding without resistance. And that observation undermined years of subtle messaging my parents had cultivated about my supposed difficulty or ingratitude, and I knew those impressions would not vanish overnight, but they would change, and change was enough. And the man beside me finally spoke again, not to the crowd, but to me, informing me quietly that compliance was being documented and that the next steps would be communicated formally, and his voice did not carry beyond us because it did not need to, and I nodded in response, aware that the most important part of this moment was not what was said, but what was seen. And as the door opened again and my father stepped out with a new set of keys, his movements stiff and deliberate, the street seemed to lean forward collectively because this was the visible confirmation of what had already been decided. And when he handed the keys to the man without meeting my eyes, the act completed the shift. Not symbolically, but practically, and the neighbors witnessed it without comment, and that witnessing mattered because communities remember who complied and who resisted, who adapted and who clung to control. And I understood then that the jury had not been asked to decide who was right. It had been asked only to observe what happened when authority was tested, and the answer had been clear enough for anyone paying attention. And as the man accepted the keys and confirmed access had been restored, the street did not erupt or disperse immediately. It simply absorbed the outcome, and that absorption marked the end of one narrative and the beginning of another one in which I was no longer defined by accusation or silence, but by the simple fact of standing where I belonged, while the world watched and took note. The moment access was restored, the situation moved from confrontation into consequence with a speed that surprised everyone except the man standing beside me, because process does not linger once compliance begins, and he explained calmly that the next steps would be immediate and formal, outlining them, not as threats, but as facts, and he stated that written notice would be served within 24 hours, confirming my authority as trustee and beneficiary, and specifying the requirements for transition, including a timeline for vacating the premises by current occupants that did not align with the trust purpose. And my father reacted sharply to that, finally looking at me directly and asking how soon, his voice tight with disbelief, as if he expected mercy to appear at the last moment. And the man answered that the standard notice period was 30 days for personal effects only, no fixtures, no shared furnishings claimed as communal property, and that any attempt to remove protected assets would be documented and addressed, and those words landed with a clarity that left no room for interpretation because they translated abstract authority into lived reality. And my mother pressed her lips together as she listened, her eyes darting toward the interior of the house, as if inventorying what she believed belonged to her. And I realized then that consequence does not always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrives as limitation, the sudden narrowing of options that once felt endless. And the man continued explaining that all communications moving forward would be conducted through official channels, that unannounced visits or attempts to renegotiate in person would be recorded as interference, and that compliance during the notice period would be taken into account in any subsequent determinations. And my father nodded stiffly, absorbing the language of conditional cooperation, and my brother Ethan stood silently near the doorway, his earlier confusion replaced by a dawning understanding that the house he had always assumed was a constant was no longer a given, and that understanding marked him more deeply than any raised voice could have, because it challenged the safety he had relied on without questioning. And the neighbors remained where they were not out of curiosity now, but because the unfolding details held a different kind of gravity, the kind that makes people pay attention to the mechanics of consequence rather than the spectacle of conflict. And I felt the weight of their attention without discomfort for the first time, because what they were witnessing was not my removal, but my recognition, and the man concluded by stating that an inventory walkthrough would be scheduled to document the condition of the property, and that any necessary arrangements would be communicated in writing. And that statement marked a shift from emotional confrontation to administrative reality, the point where control gives way to compliance or penalty. And my father swallowed hard and asked whether there was any flexibility, any way to slow things down. And the man replied that timelines were designed to balance fairness and protection, and that flexibility was not discretionary in this case because discretion had already proven harmful, and that explanation did not invite argument. It closed it. And my mother finally spoke again, her voice low and strained as she asked where they were supposed to go. And the question hung in the air because it revealed the reversal at the heart of the day. The people who had thrown my things outside now faced the uncertainty they had assumed belonged to me, and the man answered that relocation was their responsibility and that assistance resources could be provided if requested through appropriate channels. And that answer was neither cruel nor kind. It was simply accurate, and accuracy has a way of stripping away entitlement. And I felt a quiet resolve settle deeper within me as I listened because this was the boundary made real, not through anger or distance, but through procedure that did not bend to history or habit. And as the man finished outlining the immediate steps, he turned to me and asked if I had any questions, and I shook my head, not because there were none, but because I trusted the structure already in motion, and that trust was new and steady. And my parents stood there absorbing the shift, their faces reflecting the strain of recalculating a future they had never prepared for. And the neighbors began to disperse slowly. Then, not abruptly, but with the understanding that the essential moment had passed, that the verdict had been rendered, and the consequences set. And as they returned to their houses, the street regained its ordinary shape, but the ordinariness felt altered, because ordinary life resumed with a different set of truths acknowledged, and the man beside me noted the time and confirmed that documentation would be delivered promptly, and he asked me to confirm my preferred address for correspondence. And when I gave it to him, I realized with a quiet certainty that this was not just the end of a confrontation, but the beginning of a new order, one defined not by fear or favoritism, but by clear lines and enforceable limits. And as my parents retreated inside to begin the task of packing under conditions they did not control, I remained where I was grounded by the knowledge that immediate consequences had been set not to punish, but to protect, and that protection was no longer theoretical, it was active, visible, and irreversible. When the street finally emptied and the man closed his folder with the quiet finality of work completed, the noise of the day did not disappear, so much as retreat indoors. And the aftershock arrived not with drama, but with a hollow stillness that settled over everything like dust after a collapse. And I felt it most acutely when I crossed the threshold of the house again because stepping inside did not feel like a return so much as an arrival into unfamiliar territory. Even though every wall and hallway carried memory, and the air inside was thick with tension that had nowhere left to perform, and my parents moved through the rooms with stiff purpose avoiding my eyes. Their earlier outrage replaced by a brittle focus on logistics because when control collapses, people often cling to tasks. And my father began opening drawers and cabinets, methodically muttering under his breath as he inventoried what he believed he could take, while my mother hovered near the kitchen table, clutching her phone, scrolling through contacts as if hoping someone might intervene, and the contrast between their earlier certainty and this quiet scrambling was stark. And I realized then that the most profound consequence was not legal or financial, but psychological. The sudden loss of narrative dominance. And my brother Ethan retreated to his room without a word, closing the door softly behind him. And that sound carried more weight than any argument because it marked the moment he understood that silence would not protect him either. And I stood in the living room taking in the space as it existed now. Not as a battleground, but as a structure, finally stripped of pretense, and I felt a mix of emotions rise and fall without settling into any single one relief braided with grief, steadiness, edged with sadness, because endings rarely feel clean even when they are necessary. And my mother approached me then cautiously, her voice low as if afraid of being overheard even though no one else was listening, and she asked whether I was satisfied now, whether this outcome felt like justice to me, and the question revealed more than she intended because it framed justice as personal satisfaction rather than accountability. And I understood then that explaining would not bridge the gap between us because we were operating from entirely different definitions of harm. And I answered her honestly but briefly, telling her that this was not about satisfaction. It was about safety and boundaries, and the words seemed to confuse her because safety had never been part of the conversation in our family, only behavior and obedience. And she shook her head slowly, as if trying to reconcile my answer with the story she had told herself for years. And my father emerged from the bedroom then with an armful of items, stopping short when he saw us facing each other, and for a moment it seemed like he might explode again. But instead, he set the items down heavily and asked in a flat voice whether there was anything else he needed to know, anything else waiting to surface. And the question was less a challenge than a plea for certainty, because uncertainty is unbearable to those who once controlled outcomes, and I told him the truth, that there was nothing hidden beyond what had already been disclosed, that the process was documented and would proceed as outlined, and that clarity was now available to everyone whether they welcomed it or not. And he nodded slowly, absorbing the finality of that statement. And I could see the weight of years press down on him, the realization that authority he had assumed was permanent had been contingent all along, and the house grew quiet again as they returned to packing the sounds of tape tearing and boxes sliding, replacing raised voices, and I moved through the rooms deliberately, not to supervise, but to reclaim my presence, touching door frames and light switches as if to anchor myself in the reality that this space no longer required vigilance. And in the study, I paused, feeling the echo of my grandmother's influence most strongly there, because it was the only room that had never felt hostile. And I allowed myself a moment of stillness, acknowledging the cost of what had been lost alongside the necessity of what had been gained. And when I returned to the hallway, I found Ethan sitting on the floor outside his room, his knees drawn up, staring at nothing in particular, and he looked up at me with an expression that held fear and something like apology, and he asked quietly whether I hated him now, and the simplicity of the question cut through the complexity of the day, because it revealed how deeply he had relied on the family hierarchy without understanding its consequences, and I told him honestly that I did not hate him, but that things would be different. And that difference was not a punishment but a boundary, and he nodded as if accepting something he could not yet articulate. And as the evening light faded through the windows, the house settled into a new rhythm. One defined not by raised voices or silent dread, but by the measured movement of people adjusting to limits they could no longer ignore. And I understood then that the aftershock was not something to be feared. It was the necessary settling after a structure built on imbalance had been corrected. And though the quiet felt heavy, it also felt honest because nothing remained hidden, and that honesty was the foundation upon which whatever came next would be built. The consequences did not arrive all at once like a storm, but unfolded steadily over the weeks that followed, each one small on its own, but together reshaping everything my parents had assumed would remain unchanged, and I observed them with a distance that surprised me. Not because I lacked feeling, but because the chaos that once accompanied conflict was gone, replaced by procedure and time. And time has a way of revealing truths people try to outrun, and within days formal notices arrived outlining deadlines and conditions in language that did not soften or accuse. It simply stated what would happen and when, and my parents responded the only way they knew how, by attempting to negotiate indirectly, leaving notes on the kitchen counter, suggesting compromises hinting at shared history, framing requests as reasonable adjustments, and I read them without anger and without response. Because engagement would have implied that the boundaries were flexible, and they were not, and the quiet refusal to renegotiate proved more destabilizing than any argument could have, because it left them alone with the reality of adapting. And adaptation is difficult for people who have spent years shaping others instead of themselves. And as the 30-day notice period progressed, the house changed in subtle ways. Rooms emptied, walls revealed lighter patches where furniture had stood for years, drawers that once held a mixture of ownership now divided cleanly into what could be taken and what could not. And each separation felt symbolic because it forced acknowledgement of limits that had always existed but had never been respected. And my father struggled the most with this shift, moving through the house with visible frustration, often pausing mid-task as if expecting something to interrupt the process and restore the old order. And when nothing did, he grew quieter, his movements slower, his certainty eroding in small increments. And my mother adapted differently, focusing on logistics and appearances, arranging boxes, neatly making calls to relatives with carefully framed explanations that emphasized misunderstanding and unfairness without mentioning locks or documents. And I listened to her side of those conversations from a distance, recognizing the familiar pattern of narrative control. But this time, the narrative had limited reach because it could not change what was happening here, and that limitation was new. For her and my brother Ethan existed in a state of uneasy awareness, packing his things with more care than urgency, asking few questions but watching everything closely. And I realized that for him, the long-term consequence was not displacement, but awakening the slow recognition that the structure he relied on had been conditional, and that recognition would shape him long after this chapter closed. And for me, the consequences manifested as something quieter and more profound, a sense of safety I had never fully experienced before. Because for the first time, my presence in the house did not require vigilance, and I could move through rooms without bracing for confrontation or judgment, and that freedom altered my body as much as my mind. My shoulders relaxed, my breathing deepened, my sleep steadied, and those changes reinforced the understanding that what I had lived with before was not normal stress but sustained tension. And as the final week approached, my parents' interactions with me diminished further, not out of reconciliation, but out of resignation. Because resignation follows when control fails repeatedly. And on the final day, my father carried the last box to his car without comment, his face set in an expression that suggested loss rather than anger, and my mother lingered near the door, hesitating as if waiting for a closing scene that would rewrite the ending. And when none came, she gathered her things and left as well. And the sound of the car pulling away did not bring relief or triumph. It brought stillness, and that stillness felt earned, and in the days that followed, the consequences extended outward, not dramatically, but undeniably. Relationships shifted as information traveled, not through gossip, but through observation. Neighbors who once accepted my parents' version of events now greeted me with quiet respect, offering simple kindness without questions, and that change mattered because it demonstrated that truth does not need explanation when behavior has been witnessed. And professionally, my parents faced adjustments as well. Subtle at first, then more apparent as the review process triggered by their actions required documentation and accountability they had not anticipated. And while I did not follow those details closely, I understood enough to know that their choices had expanded the scope of consequence beyond the house, and that expansion reinforced the lesson embedded in the trust, that actions taken in anger do not remain contained. They ripple outward, and as the weeks turned into months, the long-term consequences solidified into new patterns. My parents settling into a smaller space that reflected reduced options, my brother navigating independence without the cushion he once assumed was permanent, and me establishing routines grounded in autonomy rather than reaction. And I recognized then that consequence is not about retribution, it is about alignment, the alignment of actions with outcomes. And for the first time in my life, that alignment was no longer distorted by fear or favoritism, and that clarity allowed something else to emerge. Not forgiveness or reconciliation, but acceptance. Acceptance that the family I had hoped for was not the family I had, and that protecting myself did not require their understanding. Only my commitment to boundaries, and that commitment would define my future more reliably than any apology ever could, because long-term consequences are not measured by how loudly they arrive, but by how quietly they reshape what remains, and what remained now was a life no longer dictated by control, but guided by choice. The house felt different once it was truly empty of resistance, not silent in a lonely way, but quiet with intention, like a space finally allowed to exhale after years of holding its breath. And I began the process of reclaiming it slowly, not out of sentimentality, but out of respect for how deeply environment shapes the nervous system, because healing does not rush it, stabilizes, and I moved room by room, making small, deliberate changes that signaled safety to myself before aesthetics ever mattered, replacing harsh lighting with softer lamps, opening windows that had been kept shut for years, rearranging furniture to remove the invisible lines of control that once dictated where I could stand or sit, and with each adjustment I felt something inside me recalibrate, because the house was no longer an extension of someone else's authority. It was becoming a container for my own life, and that shift carried emotional weight I did not fully anticipate And there were moments when grief surfaced unexpectedly, triggered by ordinary details, the sound of a cabinet closing, the creak of a stair, because grief is not just about what was lost, but about what was endured, and acknowledging that endurance without minimizing it was part of reclaiming myself. And I allowed those moments without judgment, trusting that feeling them was safer now that I was no longer required to suppress them to maintain peace. And I found myself returning often to the study where my grandmother's presence lingered most strongly, not in any mystical sense, but in the clarity of purpose she had modeled, and I spent time there reading the documents she had left behind, not to relive the confrontation, but to understand the care embedded in their structure, because care expressed through foresight is easy to miss until it is needed, and I recognized then that the trust was not a weapon or a punishment. It was an act of guardianship extended across time. And that realization softened something in me because it reframed the story from conflict to protection, and as weeks passed, the routines I built reinforced that narrative: mornings that began with calm rather than dread, evenings that ended without replaying conversations in my head, choices made without anticipating retaliation, and those changes accumulated quietly into a sense of stability I had never known. And healing showed up not as dramatic breakthroughs, but as the absence of familiar tension, the quiet confidence of knowing where I stood and that no one could push me from it without consequence. And I noticed how my body responded to that stability, how my posture changed, how my voice steadied, how my sleep deepened, because the body remembers safety even when the mind struggles to trust it at first. And as I reclaimed the house physically, I also reclaimed parts of myself that had been constrained by constant vigilance, interests I had set aside, friendships I had kept, distant ambitions I had downplayed to avoid scrutiny, and allowing those parts to surface felt both exhilarating and unsettling, because growth often feels unfamiliar before it feels good, and I learned to sit with that discomfort without retreating, reminding myself that unfamiliar does not mean unsafe, and my relationship with my brother evolved as well, not into closeness, but into something more honest, occasional conversations grounded in mutual recognition rather than hierarchy. And while reconciliation was not possible, the absence of hostility allowed space for individual accountability, and that space mattered because it demonstrated that boundaries do not have to destroy connection. They simply redefine its terms, and I began to understand that healing was not about rewriting the past or extracting apologies. It was about integrating what happened without letting it dictate my future, and that integration required patience, the same patience my grandmother had shown in preparing protections quietly over time. And as I stood in the front yard one evening watching the light fade across the street, I realized that reclaiming the house was symbolic but secondary. The real reclamation was internal, the reclaiming of agency of voice, of the right to exist without earning safety, and that understanding brought a deep, steady peace, because it meant the cycle of control ended, not with confrontation, but with choice. My choice to live differently, and that choice was reinforced every day by the environment I had reclaimed and the boundaries I maintained, and I knew then that healing was not a destination, but a practice, one that would continue to shape my life long after the legal consequences faded from memory. Because the greatest outcome of the day my parents threw my things outside was not the reversal of that act, but the clarity it forced. Clarity that allowed me to build a life rooted in safety rather than fear, and that clarity was the most enduring inheritance of all. The longer I lived inside the quiet boundaries of my own choosing, the clearer the moral shape of everything that had happened became, not as a single lesson, but as a pattern finally visible without distortion, and I realized that what had unfolded was never truly about property or paperwork. It was about power, and how easily power disguises itself as love when it goes unchecked, and that realization settled, slowly deepening with time, rather than fading, because distance has a way of clarifying motives that proximity obscures, and I could see now how often my parents had framed control as protection, how discipline had been justified as guidance, how silence had been demanded in the name of harmony, and none of those justifications survived outside the system that enforced them. And that was the moral reckoning they never fully faced, because systems that benefit from imbalance rarely interrogate themselves. And I understood then that the trust my grandmother created did more than protect a house. It forced a moral accounting without argument because it removed the ability to reinterpret behavior once consequences were attached, and that accounting did not require me to accuse or explain or persuade. It existed independently of my voice, and that independence was its greatest strength. And as I reflected on this, I became aware of how often society encourages endurance over boundaries, especially within families, and how readily people ask victims of control to be patient, forgiving, flexible, while rarely asking those who wield power to examine its impact. And I recognized how close I had come to internalizing those expectations myself, how easily I had learned to equate compliance with goodness and resistance with selfishness, and disentangling those beliefs was part of the moral resolution I was now living, because I could finally see that choosing safety was not an act of cruelty, but an act of responsibility. Responsibility to myself and to the future I wanted to build. And that clarity reshaped how I understood fairness, because fairness is not the equal distribution of discomfort. It is the prevention of harm, and harm does not become acceptable simply because it is familiar or framed as tradition. And I thought often of the neighbors who had watched the confrontation unfold, not because their judgment mattered, but because their presence underscored a truth many people avoid: that abuse and control often persist because they remain unseen. And when they are seen, they lose some of their power. And I understood that my grandmother had counted on that visibility not to shame, but to anchor truth in something observable. And that choice revealed her wisdom more clearly with time, because she did not rely on confrontation or condemnation. She relied on structure and record. And structure endures where emotion fades, and that endurance carried a moral weight I now carried forward not as a burden, but as guidance. And I began to notice how this clarity influenced my decisions beyond the family context, how I became more attentive to power dynamics in other relationships, more willing to name discomfort early, less inclined to excuse patterns that mirrored what I had escaped, and that awareness felt like growth rather than bitterness, because it expanded my capacity to choose differently rather than narrowing my trust. And I also came to understand that my parents' suffering was not evidence that my boundaries were wrong, because consequences are not cruelty when they follow choices freely made, and acknowledging that truth did not require me to harden my heart. It required me to accept reality without rewriting it to soothe guilt, and that acceptance was part of my own moral resolution, because it allowed me to stop rehearsing justifications and start living. And I recognized then that forgiveness was not the appropriate metric for healing in this situation, because forgiveness implies a debt to be erased, and what existed instead was a boundary to be maintained. And maintaining it did not preclude compassion, it simply refused access to harm. And that distinction mattered deeply because it freed me from the expectation that healing required reconciliation. And as months passed and the intensity of the legal consequences faded into background administration, the moral clarity remained guiding me quietly in choices large and small. And I realized that the most profound outcome of the day my parents threw my things outside was not the reversal of that act, but the exposure of a truth I could no longer unsee. That love without respect is control, that authority without accountability is harm, and that safety is not something you negotiate for. It is something you are entitled to protect, and that understanding did not make me angry. It made me grounded because it replaced confusion with coherence, and coherence is what allows a life to move forward without constantly looking back. And as I stood one evening in the doorway of the house watching the lights come on along the street, I felt a sense of alignment settle into place, knowing that the moral center of my life now rested in my own hands, shaped by experience, but no longer dictated by it. And that alignment was the quiet resolution my grandmother had prepared me for, long before the conflict ever arrived, trusting that one day I would recognize it for what it was and carry it forward with intention. The last boundary was not set with paperwork or deadlines, but with silence chosen deliberately and held without apology, and it came after everything practical had been resolved and the noise of consequence had quieted enough for intentions to surface. Because when control loses its leverage, it often returns disguised as reconciliation. And I saw that pattern emerge in the weeks after my parents moved out, not loudly but persistently through messages framed as concern, through requests phrased as updates, through reminders of shared history offered as invitations. And each attempt carried the same underlying question whether I would reopen the door emotionally now that the legal door had closed, and recognizing that question allowed me to answer it without anger, because anger would have implied unfinished business, and I was finished negotiating safety. And the first message came from my mother late one evening, a carefully worded note asking how I was settling in and suggesting that time had passed enough for calm conversation, and I read it once and set it aside without replying, because engagement would have implied that the boundary was provisional, and it was not. And the second message arrived days later from my father, shorter and more direct, stating that mistakes had been made and that families forgive, and that sentence revealed more than he intended because it framed forgiveness as an obligation rather than a choice. And obligation had been the mechanism of control for most of my life. And I understood then that responding would only reestablish the hierarchy they were accustomed to, with me positioned as the one who needed to resolve discomfort for everyone else. And I chose not to step back into that role. And the silence that followed was not punitive, it was protective. And I felt its effectiveness in the way my nervous system remained steady rather than spiking with anticipation, because boundaries that work create calm rather than tension, and over time the messages slowed and then stopped. Not because understanding had been reached, but because access had been denied, and that denial was the boundary in action, and my brother attempted contact once as well. Not to argue, but to ask questions, and I answered him honestly, but briefly, explaining that I needed space, and that space was not rejection, and he accepted that answer with more grace than I expected. Perhaps because he too was adjusting to limits for the first time, and the absence of constant communication allowed something else to emerge, clarity about what I was willing to offer and what I was not. And that clarity shaped my days quietly, informing choices without drama. And I realized that final boundaries are rarely dramatic declarations. They are consistent behaviors that do not bend under pressure, and maintaining them required attention at first, but grew easier with practice because my life no longer revolved around anticipating reactions. And that shift created room for new connections grounded in mutual respect rather than obligation. Friendships that did not require performance routines, that did not require permission, and those experiences reinforced the value of the boundary more effectively than any argument ever could. And I also became aware of how often people misunderstand boundaries as punishments, assuming that distance is meant to teach a lesson, when in reality, distance is often the lesson teaching both parties what is possible and what is not, and accepting that misunderstanding without correcting it was part of maintaining the boundary, because explaining would have reopened a negotiation. I had closed, and I trusted that the meaning of my choice did not require consensus to be valid, and that trust marked the final shift in power because it relocated authority entirely within me. And as seasons changed and the house settled further into its new rhythms, the boundary held without strain, and I noticed how my sense of self expanded in its presence. Not in defiance, but in steadiness, because I no longer needed to define myself in opposition to my family, only in alignment with my values. And that alignment was the quiet strength my grandmother had modeled, the ability to act without spectacle and to hold lines without cruelty. And I understood then that the final boundary was not between me and my parents, but between who I had been trained to be and who I chose to become. And choosing myself did not require their approval or understanding. It required only consistency, and that consistency became my practice, day after day. Message unanswered, invitation declined, life lived forward, and the peace that resulted was not fragile, it was durable, because it rested on decisions made consciously and maintained without exception. And as time continued to pass, the absence of contact became normal rather than tense. And normality is the clearest sign that a boundary has taken root. And I carried that knowledge with quiet confidence, knowing that the last line had been drawn not to exclude others, but to include myself fully in my own life, and that inclusion was the most definitive resolution of all. The victory did not arrive with celebration or public acknowledgement. And that was how I knew it was real, because real victories do not require witnesses once the balance has been restored. They register internally as stability, as the absence of threat, as the quiet confidence that nothing is about to be taken away. And I felt that confidence settle in gradually as weeks turned into months, and nothing erupted. No sudden confrontations, no legal reversals, no emotional ambushes disguised as concern, and that sustained calm confirmed what the confrontation itself could not, that the structure protecting me was holding, and I moved through my days without scanning for danger or rehearsing explanations because there was nothing left to defend, and that freedom altered how I understood success. Because success was no longer about proving anything to anyone, it was about living without distortion. And I noticed how the house itself seemed to respond to that shift, not in any mystical sense, but in how it functioned as a space of rest rather than vigilance. Sounds that once signaled conflict now faded into background noise. The creak of floors and hum of appliances no longer carried meaning beyond their utility, and that neutrality was a gift because it allowed me to exist without interpretation, and the quiet victory extended beyond the house into my work and relationships because I no longer approached interactions with the expectation of hidden costs, and that expectation had shaped me more than I realized, making me cautious where trust was possible and compliant where assertion was needed. And as that pattern loosened, I found myself more direct, more grounded, less willing to shrink to preserve comfort, and that shift was noticed by others, even when I did not announce it, because people respond to steadiness instinctively. And opportunities opened not because I sought them aggressively, but because I was no longer expending energy managing fear, and that energy became available for growth. And I understood then that the confrontation with my parents had been a catalyst rather than a culmination, forcing a realignment that affected every area of my life. And I thought often of how my grandmother must have understood that timing matters, that protection implemented too early can feel controlling, and protection implemented too late can feel futile. And she had chosen the moment when I was capable of standing in the outcome without collapsing, and that choice revealed her trust in me as much as her concern, and carrying that trust forward became part of my quiet victory, honoring it not through confrontation but through continuity, living well within the boundaries she had helped me secure. And there were moments when memories resurfaced unexpectedly, not as pain, but as information, reminding me how far I had come, and those moments no longer destabilized me because they existed in a different context now, one where the past did not dictate the present, and I allowed myself to acknowledge the strength it had taken to endure without romanticizing it, because endurance is not virtue when it is coerced, and I felt gratitude not for the hardship, but for the clarity that followed. And the quiet victory also involved releasing the need to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding me, because understanding is not always mutual, and requiring it can become another form of self-abandonment. And accepting that limitation without resentment was part of the peace I now lived in, and I found satisfaction in small, ordinary moments that once would have felt undeserved. Mornings spent reading without tension, evenings spent planning without fear of interference, laughter that did not check itself for appropriateness. And those moments accumulated into a life that felt fully inhabited, and I realized that victory is often misrepresented as dominance or reversal, when in reality it is autonomy sustained over time, and autonomy does not announce itself. It simply persists, and that persistence was my victory. Quiet but undeniable, because nothing my parents had relied on to control me remained effective, and nothing they could do now could reinsert them into a life that had moved beyond their reach. And that understanding did not make me feel powerful in the way control seeks power. It made me feel secure, and security is a deeper form of strength, one that does not need to be tested to be known. And as I closed the gate one evening and walked back toward the house that now felt entirely mine, I recognized that the story that began with my things thrown onto the lawn had ended, not with revenge or reconciliation, but with something more enduring, the quiet victory of a life reclaimed and protected without apology, and that victory required no audience because it would continue long after the last witness had forgotten the day it began. The moment that finally closed the circle did not come on a dramatic anniversary or with any formal acknowledgement. It arrived quietly on an ordinary morning when I realized that the memory of my parents throwing my things outside no longer carried heat, only context. And that realization mattered because it meant the event had been integrated rather than suppressed, understood rather than relived. And integration is how stories end without repeating themselves. And I stood in the kitchen making coffee as sunlight filtered through the window in a way that once would have made me tense for no reason I could explain. And this time, it did not, and that absence of tension was the clearest marker of change because the body does not lie about safety. And I thought briefly of the person I had been when this story began, the version of me who sat on the driveway surrounded by her belongings while a neighborhood watched steady on the surface and braced underneath, and I felt compassion for her rather than embarrassment or anger because she had done exactly what was needed to survive that moment. And survival is not weakness, it is intelligence under pressure. And the difference now was that I no longer lived in survival mode, and that shift altered how I related to my past because it allowed me to see continuity rather than rupture, to recognize that the same steadiness that carried me through the confrontation now carried me through ordinary days. And that continuity was the legacy my grandmother had intended. Not the house itself, but the capacity to stand without apology. And I honored that legacy, not by clinging to the past, but by living fully in the present. And the house around me reflected that choice not as a monument, but as a home shaped by use and care rather than fear. And as I moved through my morning routine, I thought about how easily this story could have ended differently with silence, with departure, with me leaving quietly to preserve appearances, and I recognized the courage it had taken to stay seated on that driveway and wait, not for rescue, but for process. And that courage had not been loud or dramatic. It had been disciplined, and discipline is often mistaken for passivity when it is in fact restraint. And restraint had been my strength throughout this story, and I understood then that restraint paired with structure is what creates lasting change, not confrontation alone, and that understanding reshaped how I thought about justice, because justice is often portrayed as dramatic reversal, when in reality it is alignment, restored, imbalance corrected, and safety enforced without exception, and that enforcement had occurred here, not because I demanded it, but because it had been prepared for, and preparation is an act of care rarely recognized until it is needed, and I felt gratitude again for my grandmother, not in a sentimental way, but in a practical one, for the foresight that allowed this story to end without me having to sacrifice myself to prove a point. And as the day unfolded, I went about my life without reference to what had happened, answering emails, planning the week ahead, making choices without checking them against anyone else. Expectations, and that ordinariness was the final confirmation that the cycle had ended, because when a cycle truly breaks, it does not demand attention, it releases it. And I thought briefly of my parents, not with resentment or longing, but with acceptance, understanding that they would carry their version of this story forward just as I carried mine, and that my responsibility ended at the boundary I had maintained, and that boundary did not require maintenance through conflict. It held on its own, and that independence was the full circle, the point where the past no longer exerted force on the present. And as evening came and I closed the house for the night, I paused for a moment in the doorway, aware that stories often end with doors closing or opening. But real endings are quieter. They happen when you stop checking whether the door is locked, because you know it is. And that knowledge settled into me with calm certainty, because nothing about my life now depended on anyone else's decision. And that was the freedom at the heart of this story. Not the house, not the documents, not the confrontation, but the internal shift that made it impossible for the pattern to repeat. And I stepped inside and turned off the light, not because I was retreating, but because the day was complete, and the quiet that followed was not empty. It was full of safety, full of choice, full of a future no longer constrained by fear, and that fullness was the ending my grandmother had protected for me long before I ever knew I would need it, closing the circle with intention and leaving nothing unresolved, only lived.